We have a lot to celebrate today. As Dave reminded us, at Cinco de Mayo, we're celebrating our graduates. We've got a brief break in the rain, which is nice. Kentucky Derby yesterday, which was fun. Anybody win some money betting on horses yesterday? Anyone? To see a few hands, great. Our business office will be in touch with you, Travis. Glad to know that. Stewardship folks wanted me to ask that. I did enjoy the Kentucky Derby, but I barely had time to get from that to game one between the Timberwolves and the Nuggets, which was an amazing game. All right, one other person enjoyed that. So lots of things to celebrate, and yet, this season that we're in, the season between Easter and Pentecost, which happens on May 19th, this is the season of Eastertide. It is itself a whole season for celebration. God has raised up the crucified Jesus, and a new way of being characterized by kindness, justice, and hope is working its way slowly but surely into the tired old world we know. So our sermon series, as Kristen mentioned, for May is titled simply Faith and Festivity. Many of the stories that Jesus tells and many of his teachings imagine life in God's new realm as a party. Life with God is more like an extravagant, joyful feast than anything else, and that's why we're celebrating communion a little bit differently today. This is good news for us, and yet it challenges all of us to examine whether the ways that we gather in our lives are sufficiently charged by this festivity. It challenges us to ask whether the tone of our lives and the texture of our faith is grounded in really great gatherings that connect us and transform us. All the polls tell us that the past 25 years have seen the steepest decline in religious affiliation, church attendance, in U.S. history. Many of our friends and neighbors, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, many of our friends and neighbors are living their lives, raising their families, fashioning their spiritualities outside the landscape and the liturgy of the church. And many faith communities, including us here at Second, are responding to this trend by asking how all the different ways we gather, in worship and otherwise, how all the different ways we gather can be more interesting, more attractive, more relevant to the rhythms and rituals of modern life. That's an important project for the church, but it's not exactly what I want to talk about today. I want to ask today whether parties might be more important than we ever realized. I want to ask whether the good news ought to foster more great get-togethers, whether baptism and a life of deepening faith, hope, and love could make us more skillful hosts and more gracious guests. I'm wondering, I suppose, whether faith in the 21st century might be more winsome and more compelling when it fosters festive gatherings that make people feel loved, welcomed, connected, and valued. After all, there are a few people who aren't into church, but who doesn't want to be invited to a great party? Who doesn't want to be included in a meal where there's good food and there's stories being shared? For too long, faith has been reduced to something much smaller, either to a noble moral commitment or a cluster of important beliefs or participation in a local church. Those are all good things as far as they go. But Jesus' teaching and Jesus' ministry invite us to bend our faith back in the direction of feasting and festivity. That's our theme for the day. So friends, listen now for God's word to you as we read from Luke's gospel. This is Luke 14, verse 1, and then verses 7 through 14. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to share a meal in the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." Embarrassed, you'll take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." May God bless the reading of Holy Scripture. Thanks be to God. Apparently, Jesus went to parties. Jesus went to a lot of parties. He was a regular at feasts, festivals, banquets, wedding celebrations, and intimate meals in the home of friends and in the homes of the not-so-friendly, like our passage today. And he lived in these rhythms of festivity even though his public ministry was short and his schedule was full. He went to parties even though he was part of an oppressed people group living under the constant threat of Roman violence. I said at the end of a sermon a couple of weeks ago that we can't wait to laugh, to have fun, until all the world's problems get fixed. And I want to propose something similar today, that the good news of God's love for us in Jesus Christ calls us to festive gatherings and extravagant feasts, and we cannot put these joyful celebrations on hold. It's true, of course, that our lives are busy and frequently frustrating. It's also true that the economy is uncertain and the world is turbulent. I don't need to give you examples, but I'll give you one. 2,300 people have been arrested or detained in the past couple of weeks in pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses. College graduations have been disrupted. Jewish students report feeling threatened and unsafe on their campuses. Of course, those protesting want to draw our attention to the dire situation in Gaza where people are starving. This is hard news, tough to know how to metabolize it all. Sometimes the unrest and the injustice in the world can leave us sour and sullen, can lead us to withdraw and isolate. And yet, Jesus, whose entire life was one long nonviolent protest, spent so much time partying that he became known for it, and some of his opponents grumbled about it. In Luke 7, Jesus notes that God's prophets can't ever get a break. They never win. This is Jesus in Luke 7, verse 33. John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine. In other words, he's very disciplined, very rigorous. And you all say he has a demon, he's demon-possessed. Yet the human one, the Son of Man, he's talking here about himself, the human one came eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunk, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Notice that Jesus doesn't defend himself against the charge of eating and drinking a lot at parties alongside people with questionable moral lives. He suggests instead that this feature of his life has been used by others to dismiss his claims to be the fresh arrival of God's new realm in their very midst. In our reading today, Jesus accepts an invitation to dinner at the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. Now, I've always thought that we're a little hard on Pharisees, so let's lighten up a little bit today. I find it helpful to imagine the Pharisees as people largely like me, that is, people who are trying to be religious, but more often than not miss the point completely. Even so, Luke tells us that these Pharisees had ulterior motives for inviting Jesus to dinner. They were, quote, watching him closely, Luke tells us. Now, Jesus knows all this, but he goes to dinner at the Pharisees' house anyway. Already, Jesus' meal practices invite us to a little bit of self-reflection. Do we have the grace and flexibility, the lightness and spaciousness to gather for meals and enjoy an evening with our perceived enemies? Now, I know, some of you are already thinking, of course, we do this every Thanksgiving, and fine. I'll give you credit for that. Anyway, Jesus has been invited by his opponents to dinner, and he goes. Luke doesn't tell us about the seating arrangement, who's where. There are no details about the interior decoration of the home, no notes about what was on the menu that day. Luke directs our attention to Jesus' unique way of showing up and being present at this gathering. What Jesus does is that he introduces some healthy tension into the dinner conversation by telling a story about where we put ourselves, where we seat ourselves at a party or at an event. I went to the Royals game Friday night with friends, and they happened to have very good seats. And you know what? This is profound. I'm sure it's going to be a surprise to you. It's more fun to watch a Royals game from really good seats than from seats way, way up there. Now, Jesus knows what it feels like to want the good seat, but his life is so fully aligned with God's Spirit, so fully in tune with God's new realm, that he doesn't get tangled up in or carried away by that impulse, that addiction to needing to be in first place. So he tells them a story about a banquet where some guests get humiliated and other guests were honored. Think of this as Jesus' advice about etiquette for guests at a gathering. If we live our lives and if we go to our gatherings concerned primarily with getting a good seat, Jesus teaches we're courting embarrassment. The party host might have to ask us to move and to move down. But if we can live our lives and show up at various gatherings in ways that escape this addiction to being important, we set ourselves up for good things to happen. Part of the genius of Jesus' story is that he's always talking about two things at once. On the one hand, he's talking about how to go to a party, how to be there. And on the other hand, he's talking about how to live in God's new realm. So he introduces some healthy tension at the dinner party, then he deepens it by asking his fellow guests to imagine living their lives and hosting their parties in a different way. He addresses the host of the party and invites the host to imagine giving dinner parties with different kinds of guest lists. Don't always default into inviting all the people who are already in your social networks, your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, people with time and leisure and disposable income and similar tastes. If you do that, says Jesus, these socially savvy people will likely return the favor. They'll invite you to their homes. They'll include you in their next party. And when they do that, you've been paid back. It's even Steven. The loop is closed. And while you've done nothing wrong, neither have you introduced any fresh novelty into your social rhythms, into the circulation of goods. Do something different, Jesus suggests to the party. Instead of inviting the kinds of people with resources to return the favor, include some people who don't get many invitations. Ask someone to join the gathering who doesn't fit, who might surprise some of the other guests. Throw a curveball. Invite an outlier or two. Now, the people that Jesus names are people who live with disabilities. And one of the things I continue to learn from Reverend Latia, leader of the Open Table, is always to be aware of assumptions I'm making about those who live with disabilities. So when Jesus invites his guests to imagine a different kind of world and different kinds of gatherings that include the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, I don't think Jesus is marking out these folks with negative value. Instead, he's naming groups of people who get habitually locked out of the economy. People with limitations that leave them outside most social flows. Don't keep dancing with all the same people in your circle, Jesus teaches. Make your circle a little bigger and a little more interesting. Okay. In today's sermon, so if you're thinking, what do you want out of us? I'll tell you what I want out of you. In today's sermon, I'm not asking you to believe anything. You don't have to believe a darn thing. I'm not asking you to feel any certain way. Nor am I asking you to do something that's onerous or burdensome or hard, okay? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to host a party. That's it. That's your job. I'd like you to do it during the month of May. But even putting it that way, that I want you to host a party, is saying it a little too large. I want you to create some kind of gathering that feels festive and celebratory, something that connects you and other people in meaningful ways, okay? In your bulletin, you'll notice where the sermon is, there are 3 lines. 3 lines that are labeled small, medium, and large. This is not for your drink order. Fill in the blanks here. I want you to leave here this morning with 3 concrete ideas for possible gatherings. I'm not asking you to do all 3, you'll just do one. But I want you to imagine, while I'm talking, you can kind of tune me out if you need to, a small version, a medium version, and a large version of some way you could gather that feels festive or that connects you to other people during the month away. So on the small line, think really, really small here, like almost not a gathering. On the small line, it could just be, is there a person that you could text or call or send an email to, send a card to, either telling them how much they mean to you, expressing your appreciation for something they do well, congratulating them. It's, we're celebrating our graduates today. The small line can be that small. On the medium line, right, put something on this line as a gathering that will take a little bit more effort, right? But we're still trying to keep it manageable. Imagine here a small gathering, not much preparation required, limited time commitment. So do whatever you want, but you might propose a walk, taking a walk, or coffee, or lunch, something simple. That's the medium line. For the third line, the larger idea, right, make it a little bigger, right? This might be a brunch or a dinner, it might be at a restaurant, it might be something you want to host in your home, it might include a few more people. And here, this will take a little thinking and a little planning ahead of time about who you're going to gather, what's the purpose, how can you create some healthy tension, right? Some aliveness in that gathering. How can you use it to connect people? So put something on each of those lines, if you will. You're not making a commitment to do them. This is just a menu of possibilities as you move into the month of May. And if today, hearing Jesus' stories about what parties can do, right? If that inspires you to something unusual or extravagant, that's great. If you're inspired to spend some money or invest some time preparing, go for it. But there's no expectation that this needs to be large scale. If this assignment feels burdensome to you, then immediately time out, back it down, right, to some level where it feels manageable. If money's tight, do something that doesn't cost anything. If you're not thrilled about doing this by yourself, maybe you're an introvert, partner up with somebody. Find a friend, a neighbor, somebody in your pew that might do this with you. If you say, I've got several gatherings planned in May already, great, those count. Right? You don't have to add something new if you already have things on your schedule. You might simply use this morning as a chance to reflect on how you could enrich and deepen that gathering. Priya Parker has a book called The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters. In it, Parker encourages us to make our gatherings intentional and intentionally good. Her book is helpful if you want to learn how to throw a really good party. She begins her book like this, quote, "The way we gather matters. Gatherings consume our days and help determine the kind of world we live in both our intimate and public realms. Gathering, that is, the conscious bringing together of people for a reason, shapes the ways we think, feel, and make sense of our world," end quote. And yet she goes on to point out that most of the gatherings we attend end up disappointing us. Most gatherings happen in the same tired ways, following the same stale formulas. And Parker believes that with a little effort, a little planning, our gatherings can actually soar, dazzle, connect, and transform. And so she writes this book in order to help the rest of us shift our ordinary moments into unforgettable, meaningful gatherings. The manifesto from her introduction goes like this, and I hope this inspires you, but also makes it manageable. I believe that everyone has the ability to gather well. You don't have to be an extrovert. In fact, some of the best gatherers I know suffer from social anxiety. You don't need to be a boss or a manager. You don't need a fancy house. The art of gathering, fortunately, doesn't rest on your charisma or the quality of your jokes. This is good news for many of you. Gatherings crackle and flourish when real thought goes into them, when often invisible structure is baked into them, and when a host has the curiosity, willingness, and generosity of spirit to try. Parker has lots of good advice. I'm just going to give you a little bit as we end this morning. She suggests that it's a really bad idea to aim to be a casual, low-key, or chill host without an agenda. She thinks that's a bad idea. Set you up for not a very good gathering. She suggests that hosts should practice what she calls a generous authority, by which she means that hosts can create meaningful gatherings by creating a little good controversy, like Jesus did. And so to do that, you might make use of some of the following kinds of questions, whether you're in groups of 2 or 12, right? So here are just some ideas. If you want to use any of these and you want them, email me later, I'm going to give them to you. So just examples, right? Tell me about a moment in your early life that deeply influenced you and in some way perhaps led you to the work you do today, okay? That's a better party than if just blah, 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 small talk, chit, chat. Tell us something that would surprise us, but try not to mention any successes or accomplishments. I love what comes after the comma. What have you rebelled against in the past, and what are you rebelling against now? If you gave me that question, I would come to your party. That's fascinating. How have your priorities changed over the years? Or which parts of your life have been a waste of time? Woo, there's a good one, right? At Second's Leadership Retreat this past February, I created a little bit of tension, a little bit of heat by asking our elders, deacons, and staff to bring an object with them, to bring something old and to use it as a way to introduce themselves. I said, bring something old that's been put to a new use in your life or something that's been passed down to you that you've kept around. Our theme for the day was talking about like innovation and tradition, borrowing the past and bending it to new uses. And so these object-based introductions were meant to sort of enhance our theme. People did it. They brought stuff and shared their stories. And this introduction time took way longer than I had anticipated. I ended up canceling several other things I'd planned to do at that retreat, and it was absolutely worth it. People held up those objects and told those stories. It was funny, heartwarming, and deeply connecting, and we got to know one another at levels that were just absolutely wonderful. So steal that idea if you need that one for a gathering. Our neighborhood bar in New Haven was Archie Moore's Pub. It's a great place. And there was a sign above the bar at Archie Moore's Pub that read, "All ye who enter here on refreshment bent shall welcome be, and forth with blessings sent." That was an important gathering place for us for 9 or 10 years of our lives, and that message about what gatherings can do has shaped our family's life, and so we recreated that sign, and it now hangs near our dining table to remind us what's possible. Friends, the good news is that Christ is risen, and you are connected and beloved, called to host little parties that soar and sing with the joy of God's new realm. I look forward to hearing about what happens when you gather. Amen.